It says, in case of emergency, break glass with wrench. Hold on. This one says, use rock to break glass to get wrench to break glass to get rock. Ooh, I love logic puzzles. Let's see. If you break the glass with the...
Solved it. Ratchet and Clank 2, Going Commando. A game where you might not notice the 2 in the title. I actually had to look up which one was the second one in the game because the 2 connects like the main title with the subtitle, and it's actually kind of not strong logo design at all. Also, that subtitle is effectively useless because that whole being commando thing, yeah, that gets referenced like once in the game and then otherwise is just never really mentioned. This is the sequel to Ratchet and Clank, and many years ago I played the original along with the other first games of the 3 PS2 trilogies, having never played any of them, and as a quick recap, I remember thinking Ratchet and Clank was by far the weakest out of the 3. Not a bad game, mind you, but I felt like it got really hard in some places, could use some checkpoints, and its adherence to its own satire affected its own gameplay negatively. Okay, so the story to Ratchet and Clank Going Commando is that Ratchet and Clank are, you know, they were celebrated as the heroes that saved the galaxy in the previous game, which is great. And then the accolades and the hero worship really died down and they just kind of stopped doing everything. And Ratchet's kind of bored with that. Fortunately for them, they get kidnapped by a CEO of a mega conglomerate from another galaxy and are told to go and save that galaxy by effectively rescuing an experiment that was kidnapped from their corporation by a mysterious person. Clank, not wanting any of this, instead gets a job as an accountant, effectively removing him from the first third of the game. And Ratchet's off on his own, undergoing commando training behind the scenes so that, you know, the title makes sense. Now, the thing about the first game was it adhered to its core concept, the idea that consumerism, and by extension capitalism, was bad, especially when taken to extremes, over top of, you know, just being a decent human being and helping out where available. And it did such a strong job of it that I think it affected the gameplay negatively. When you would often go out and rescue people to get a core item that you needed to advance, you still had to pay for it. And that really bugged me, especially when this game had really high, expensive items that you couldn't buy on the first possible playthrough, but I actively didn't want to buy anything because I was saving up for the big fancy gun. And that still happens. It still adheres to the whole capitalism is bad subtext, but it doesn't really follow through in any meaningful way aside from, like, those occasional people that try and fleece a little extra money out of you, and maybe right near the end. So you have a core concept that's sort of not connected with the rest of the game in any meaningful way, trying to connect it back to the first game. But what's perhaps an even weirder disconnect is the fact that Ratchet and Clank actually feels like it has very little interaction between the two. The first game featured the two characters at odds with each other. Ratchet was entirely about himself. He wanted fame and money and all the accolades and whatever, and Clank just wanted to do the right thing. They were constantly butting heads, and it was sort of a buddy cop, sort of odd couple thing going on. And by the end, up until the final cutscene, that you really saw that they connected with each other. And that was great. But now they've lost that dynamic because now they're just best friends. So you lose the sort of dynamic the two characters have, on top of the fact that Clank is removed for the first third of the game just to, I guess, let you better explore Ratchet's abilities. It feels like the Ratchet and Clank dynamic have no actual Ratchet and Clankiness in Ratchet and Clank. They're just sort of there because they were there in the first game. It just feels weird. The final thing about the story that kind of bugged me was the villain of the game. Now, if you don't want spoilers, that's cool. I'll put up a chapter, you can skip it, but who was the villain of this game exactly? I've beaten this game and it's weird. Like, okay, it starts off with you getting hired by the CEO to defeat this mercenary who kidnapped this experiment. And we see numerous times that this mercenary basically wants to destroy or kill this experiment. It's a sort of living creature of sorts. Up to the point where, like, as a last-ditch effort, this mercenary tries to fire the experiment into space, which will surely kill it. Well, it turns out that that mercenary is actually just a scientist who wants to fix the experiment, as opposed to, you know, shooting it into space? They don't explain that terribly well. In fact, the entire motivation of this character could be explained in a single line of dialogue to Ratchet and or Clank, saying, hey, yeah, this is a dangerous thing, I just want to fix it. That's it. Problem solved. Instead, they decide to get all super hostile, and to be fair, the start of the game, Ratchet's actively assaulting the ship that's being, like, controlled by her, but, like, at no point do you ever seem to see a connection where they're trying to explain, this isn't entirely on the level, let's just, you know, take a step back and understand what I'm doing. And there's plenty of times where this character's invincible and has plot armor where you could be doing that. Indeed, her own actions don't actually make a lot of sense in the whole grand scheme of, again, trying to just fix this problem. So it's explained that she's not really the villain. Also, I guess she's the same race as whatever the hell Ratchet is, and that's fine, I guess. And they end up creating like a weird, like, romance sort of undertone there for some reason. But that leads to the question, who's the villain? Well, the mercenary lady, I believe her name is Angela, she then proceeds to tell you, well, it's the guy who hired you, you know, the big CEO guy? Turns out he's evil. He knows that this experiment is actually evil, and he just wants to destroy the world with it. Except the game can't decide if that's the tone it wants to go for, because, like, it seems to waffle between, yeah, the CEO is incredibly evil and trying to kill you and, you know, do all this, and then it flips between, no, he's actually just sort of inept and you need to explain things to him and the problem's solved. And the game literally flip-flops between that without making a decision, literally up until the final boss, where they realize, actually, the villain is Quark, who at this point was only mentioned in 3 sort of background cutscenes, who just disguised himself as the CEO so that he could be a hero of this place. Except he's not even the villain, because he then gets eaten by the monster, and then you just have to fight the monster, and then you're done. They don't introduce the villain until literally the final boss, where he's then proceeded to not be made the villain. I will give the sort of introduction of Captain Quark at the end one little bit of credit, and that is that it is a cool reflection of Ratchet's own desires. Like, it does that really kind of awkward thing that every piece of media likes to do with a hero, which is that the villain is like just a dark reflection of them. Because going back to the start of this, the whole reason why Ratchet and Clank kind of split up is Ratchet was desiring more and more to be a hero. Whereas, you know, Clank, he was totally fine just, you know, eventually being an accountant. You know, they were fine with that, but Ratchet, he wanted to be a hero. Whereas, you know, Quark is setting Ratchet up as the villain while sort of manufacturing a sort of scenario where he himself can become the hero. It basically ends up creating sort of a dark reflection of what Ratchet's desires at the start were. And that's cool from a thematic standpoint, even though, like, every media ever does this, it's a very played out trope. I do appreciate it thematically, but I don't think it makes it better that they literally introduce the villain right before the final boss and then totally make a joke of him. I mean, at the very least, give us some clues that this is sort of happening in the background. All you get prior to this is like 3 cutscenes that mention Quark, and they're completely disconnected with everything else. Like a thing that gets mentioned offhand to build like background for like the greater lore of the series. Like he might come back later or something, and just comes out of nowhere, and there really aren't any tangible hints that can connect you to the actual situation. It just feels like an unearned, cheap sort of twist that doesn't really work, even though thematically it is kind of neat. The whole plot of this game feels like just dicking around in the galaxy with like a very, very minor subtext of capitalism is bad, seeking glory and being a hero for the sake of it is bad, and we should all just be better people. Followed by, oh yeah, that's right, we need to actually have a reason to do all this stuff. None of the characters' actions really feel like they make a lot of sense, and it just seems weirdly paced. Like, nothing in the story makes sense, none of the writing really makes sense. It all feels like writing was an afterthought in this game. In fact, it feels like they spent too much time writing the comedy than the actual story. Like, if you actually listen to some of these lines, it feels like they were just sort of rushed and banged out to get information across. If I recall, at one point, one of the characters just tells you, oh yeah, we've changed the name of the big MacGuffin to something else now, by the way, just so things aren't confusing. It does feel like it's being explained to you in, like, the way people actually talk to each other, so it feels a little bit more natural in terms of, like, how dialogue is put across, but it doesn't seem like it was actually written with the intent of actually getting information across, you know? Now, Ratchet and Clank is, at its core, a third-person shooter with some mild platforming elements. And I do think the third-person shooting is quite good. For some reason, there's an ability to, like, go to a first-person mode, but you're entirely, like, planted in place if you use it, so it's not the most useful ability ever. The platforming itself is a little bit weird, though. you will often end up falling to your death and dying and restarting at previous checkpoints, and like the previous Ratchet and Clank, it really could stand to have a bunch more checkpoints and maybe a few less awkward areas that are just filled with less enemies, but a lot of the platforming ends up coming through in the use of your various gadgets, specifically Clank. And while Clank is removed for the first third of the game, you do eventually get him back, and all of his abilities are added to your repertoire. And by that I mean they basically let all of his abilities from the previous game carry forward to here, which is great, right? Yeah, that's where things get a little bit weird. See, you do have the Hydro Pack, the Hover Pack, and the Jet Pack, but you don't really need 60% of them. The Hydro Pack just makes you swim a little bit faster, but you can, and indeed in one case, need to swim before you even have it, so it doesn't really add anything that's absolutely necessary. But what's more baffling is the fact that the Hover Pack and the Jet Pack functionally do the exact same thing in this game. Sure, in the previous game it was all about extending your jump and letting you jump faster and fall slower, but they worked functionally very different. That's why they were two separate upgrades. In this game, as far as I can tell, they are functionally treated as the same object. It's really just a matter of selecting which one you like better, the awkward, goofy propellers or the jetpack. And that seems like a huge waste. Granted, that means you save time tutorializing people who never played the first game what these all do, but just seems like a waste, you know? Likewise, there are not a ton of gadgets in this game, but about 5 of them get relegated to a weapon slot. And while that's not necessarily a bad thing, there is a selectable quick swap system in place. The gadgets themselves never seem to get too much use, but it's obnoxious to go through the regular menu just to select them. Like really, I just think the quick selection should have had more slots overall, especially because there's like 20 weapons and you easily fill all those slots, and having to go through the menus just to swap to a platforming necessary item is really just awkward. Structurally, this game is basically identical to the original Ratchet and Clank. You go through areas, you get to the end of an area, then you get a quick little goofy video that tells you where you need to go next. Sometimes there's a point where the path splits, although ultimately you need to take both paths in order to open everything, but usually the alternate path just gives you a gadget you need for later earlier. Otherwise, it's basically the same. Now, as a third-person shooter, you gotta be able to shoot some things. And to be fair, this game's got some fun guns. This has always been a strength of the Ratchet games, I think, and yeah, I'm playing entirely in New Game Plus, so you're seeing a lot of big flashy stuff that you kind of have to earn towards the end of the first game, but there's some interesting stuff here. For example, as you go through the game, your character, Ratchet, he levels up and he gets extra health, but every single weapon can level up as well. And then it turns into a bigger, badder version of the original weapon. Except for the weapon that shoots lava. For some reason, when that upgrades, it just becomes a standard projectile weapon that is infinitely less interesting, but it's cool to see these weapons upgrade. And hey, if you played the original, as a fun little bonus, you can actually buy most of the weapons from the first game in this game, and if you have them on a save file from the previous game, you can actually get them for free. That's pretty cool. Except for the ultimate weapon from the first game, the Rhino, that I spent an ungodly amount of time unlocking, because that's just not in here. Instead, you have to go and save up an ungodly sum of money to buy the sequel weapon, which, similar to the first game, made me not want to spend any money on anything ever. But interestingly enough, it's also not the most expensive thing in the game. There's a set of armor that's just as expensive, and there's a weapon that dwarfs both of them in expense. So you gotta save up a lot. In fact, you're not gonna be able to get anywhere near all this stuff by the end of the first playthrough. But this stuff goes boom. You start with a little explosive weapon that turns into a mini nuke, simple assault rifle that turns into a bigger machine gun. You can get homing bombs, you can get a sniper rifle that is very powerful, but it's just awkward to aim unless you go into that kind of useless first-person mode. I personally like the Bouncer. It's a gun that shoots a big bouncy explosive ball that then breaks into smaller explosive bouncy balls that home in on your targets. It's great. And what's even better is on top of the leveling up of weapons, if you found a weapon you really like, you can expend extra collectibles, the platinum bolts, to upgrade them further, giving them homing abilities, or creating arcing electricity off every shot to do extra damage, or acid rounds to do damage over time. If you find a weapon that you like in this game, you can dedicate a lot to upgrading them and improving them, and that's definitely appreciated. It's fun to run around and play with all these wacky explosive weapons and create big booms and destroy all the environment, taking out all the enemies around you. It's a ton of fun. There's a lot here that I like, but there is one big thing gameplay-wise that really does irk me, and that is something you have to do in the story, not once, but twice. Yeah, this game's got filler for some reason. Like, at 2 points in the story, you're forced to go into these giant open sandbox areas and just collect random MacGuffins, just to advance the plot. And in each of these areas, there's 100 of each collectible. Now granted, you don't need all of them to advance the plot. You need 10 in the first set, and about 20 or so in the second. It's filler. Plain and simple. You can't advance until you've collected all these things to get a thing to advance the plot. That's all it is. It's a waste of time. Also, Clank has like 2 moments where he's running around controlling robots to solve puzzles, and like the first game, it just felt slow and disinteresting, which is probably why there's less of them than, you know, the shooting and explosioniness. But on the other hand, there's a lot more minigame type events in this game. You've got stomping around as giant Mecha Clank fighting alien invaders. You have flying around as a ship blowing stuff up, and you can upgrade the ship as time goes on, which is also a ton of fun. Adds a little bit more replayability and customization. Huge thumbs up for that. You also have arena battles where you just fight waves and waves of enemies and bosses and new challenges that get thrown your way. And I really enjoyed these little areas. In fact, that last bit I think was probably the inspiration for the Ratchet Gladiator game. Deadlocked, I think? I haven't played it, but you know, it was a fun time, and it was a great way to level up my weapons, earn extra bolts to buy upgrades and other fun stuff. It was genuinely a great little distraction. And sure, the game forces you to go through them, but it doesn't feel like a total waste of time wandering around the desert, collecting crap. You know, it's sticking to the core principles of using fun weapons to blow stuff up and using your skills to survive. Huge fan of that. Granted, I think a lot of these minigames are a little bit jank and they're not perfect. I still think they're a great addition to the game. I think at its core, Ratchet Going Commando is not perfect gameplay-wise. I think there's a lot of jank here. I think there's a lot of issues from the first game that continue moving forward to this game. It needs more checkpoints. It needs less instant deaths from platforming failure. Or, you know, again, just more checkpoints to make it less obnoxious. It needs a few less awkwardly designed enemy waves, but otherwise, you know, if you like the first Ratchet & Clank, you'll probably enjoy this one as well, because it gives you more or less the same, but just more, and I don't want to say better, but it certainly does give you more weapons and more explosions and more fun times. If you can get past the incredibly dumb plot and the kind of weird, like, sandboxy, time-wasty bits, you know, there's a lot here that I think you could like. Especially if you like the original game. Now, the overall presentation to Ratchet 2 HD on the PS3 is pretty solid. It has the same issues a lot of HD remakes have, in that, like, you know, it gives you a bigger visual, but it's not what the game was made with, so you see some jank. Occasionally I'd see, like, Clank walking in a cutscene, but his legs didn't animate because, like, the screen just wasn't cropped that way originally. It has some visual jank, which is to be expected from a lot of HD remakes, but overall I think it still looks pretty good. And the world is very interesting. The individual areas are great. I honestly don't think they're quite as memorable as the first games, but I still think they're a lot of fun, and I quite liked them. And the overall audio design is fantastic. Sound effects are basically on point, and the voice acting is excellent. You've got a lot of returning voices, Ratchet, Clank, and all that, and all the voice cast seems to be doing an excellent job. Audio-wise, it is tremendous, although I do have one bit of weirdness that I'm just going to throw in here as I was recording some of this. For some reason, the voice acting is tied to the sound effects in this game, so if you ever want to, like, just record voices and music, you can't, which is annoying because I need background audio for this, but I'd like to also keep the voice acting in case I need to use footage for something. So it's kind of a weird audio thing, but overall the music absolutely slaps, the voice acting is on point, and you know, it looks good. The total presentation certainly does have its jank because of what it is, but I think it looks pretty solid for what it is, and it sounds fantastic. Now, if you want Ratchet 2 Going Commando on the PS3, a physical copy is currently going for as low as about $40, but you get all 3 games. This was, of course, an HD remake of a PS2 game as well, and the cheapest copy of the PS2 version I'm seeing right now is $12. So it's a little bit less, but you'll be getting 3 games, so it kind of balances itself out a little bit anyway. And, you know, this being a PSN game probably is not too long to be even found anymore digitally, so, you know, scoop it up while you can, I guess, if you're a Ratchet fan, or just, you know, get the PS2 ones. Either way, I think Ratchet & Clank 2 is a pretty solid sequel if you can ignore the fact that, like, nothing in the plot actually makes sense. Gameplay-wise, it's pretty fantastic. If you can get past the issues the first game had, you'll probably have a ton of fun with this game, though. I gotta admit, when I played the first trilogy of Ratchet, Sly, and Jack, I thought Ratchet was easily the worst. Again, not a bad game, but in this instance, while I haven't played all 3 yet, I can say that between Ratchet 2 and Jack 2, I like this game a lot more. It's at least, you know, keeping true to what the core of the game actually was, and it's a solid sequel gameplay-wise. Story-wise, it's dumb, but I still say it's better than Jack 2. I've got some words about Jack 2, and maybe someday I'll actually talk about them. Still gonna play Sly 2, but I think overall, Ratchet is gameplay-wise better than the original. If you like the original, you'll love this game. Just don't think too hard about the story, because it's really dumb.